All right. Thanks, guys. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, all good. All right, perfect. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm not going to talk as much about the platform and obviously the salesy side of things. I'm just going to try to talk a little bit more about the integration of data into training, as well as some of the bigger things that we're working on now, which will be coming out later on this year, which will I think have some pretty big impact as well. So U.S. Olympic, three-time Olympic swim coach Dave Salo states that the days of just training harder are over. You need to train smarter. So when he says this, many people have said this, he's really referring to the fact that you can't just train harder anymore and hope to beat the competition because everybody trains hard. So you really need to make the most out of that training time that you do have. So today I'm talking about improving performance and reducing injury through the power of data. So first I'm going to go through a bit more on the platform. You guys probably heard a bit of a spiel yesterday, just to give you a high-level overview, but I'll talk in a little bit more detail on how this all works. But I'm just going to kind of go through that relatively quickly. Then I'm going to talk about some of the bigger things that we're now working on to help you define the right amount of training, as well as the right type of training throughout a season through load monitoring, adaptation, classification, and then also taking a quick look at how you can utilize data on a much larger scale. Okay, so really where we came from when we began looking at integrating data more effectively into training came down to some of the challenge that we were seeing in the sport from our backgrounds in the sport ourselves. Really what that first came down to was the fact that there's generally one coach on deck, maybe 30 athletes in the water, and that might be a 90-minute session. So with that many athletes, you've only really got 3 minutes per athlete per practice to work on them, and most of that time they're underwater. So if you're spending a lot of that time on a stopwatch and not actually giving them quality feedback, that was a lot of wasted time that we were seeing. So the first big piece here was that we were seeing there was trouble giving a lot of personalized feedback because the ratio of athletes to coaches was very, very high. So then next, the next big piece, obviously the limited data collection, which comes along with that. You can only really focus on a few different metrics at a time and a few different athletes at a time. So that was a big challenge we were trying to address. And then one that's a bit outside of the norm was actually athlete motivation. So what we were looking at here was the fact that we're in this sport of marginal gains. You'll train a year of full training and hopefully get 1, maybe 2 personal bests. So it's a tough sport in that respect, and it's tough for kids to think about, what do I need to do today to hit that goal at the end of the season, or even 4 or 8 years down the road if you're looking at longer cycles. So that was the next big piece that we were trying to bring in. How do we make training more engaging for athletes? So that was the kind of fundamental starting point for the platform. So really this is the platform that we began with, starting with the Triton unit that captures your performance metrics based on your motion, real-time data collection in practice, automating that collection process for coaches, and then long-term analytics and tracking kind of as never before in the sport. So this all started with the Triton unit, and I've got to go through a little bit of background on this before I get into the bigger things that we're working on to make sure everybody's up to speed on how this all works. But basically the Triton unit hooks on the back of a swimmer's goggles, so right at the back of their head here, and captures their performance metrics, again, based on their motion through the water. So we're capturing splits, stroke count, stroke rate, distance per stroke, turn time, time underwater, breath count, all the different metrics that you see up on the board here. And the way that we've done this is we've actually classified our algorithms against over 50,000 fully annotated swims. So the way that we can get to accurate data is actually by having a full-time team of data collectors that all they do is get data from the field, video footage, and then basically match the real values against what our algorithms generate. So that's how we can guarantee 4 times better accuracy than the next best competitor on the market, even looking at the big guys like Garmin out there today. So really our goal with that, in terms of giving you data that you could obviously rely on and use in practice, was giving you more data points that you could track simultaneously without having to stare at a stopwatch. But yeah, really just letting you spend more time coaching, focusing on stroke mechanics, and let us worry about the tedious data collection process, and just have these tools there available ultimately when you need them, not necessarily invasive inside of the training program. Ultimately, this also just helps you understand, more about what's going on with all of your athletes. If you're working on your sprinters on one side of the pool and your distance guys are doing a really long set, you might not really see a lot of what's going on that side of the pool. But through data, you can get a better understanding of, first of all, if they're doing what you want them to do, but more importantly, if they're doing it the way you want them to do it. Are they actually maintaining their rates? Are they maintaining their lengths? Are they actually going the right pace and threshold work that you want them to do? So this is the way it looks when data comes up to the tablet. So you're getting real-time data for every single athlete simultaneously. So really we're, again, freeing up your hands, putting all this information in front of you so you have access to it on deck. That can be cast onto a TV as well so the athletes can see it, giving you simultaneous tracking for all your kids at once. And then this allows you to dive in as deep as you want into the data or just look at high-level information. But we do it very visually so you can act on information in practice to make some informed decisions based on numbers. So again, our goal here, as I mentioned, is just clear visual trends. We're trying to give it so that it's not a big table full of numbers. It's visual data that you can see. First of all, if your athletes again are maintaining their pace, but are they also, if they're supposed to be getting faster, are they able to get faster while maintaining stroke rate or stroke count? So we're able to actually give you that in clear visual trends, so you can see that through just some quick lines on a tablet, as opposed to having to dig through a bunch of numbers. This just helps you kind of dig into weaknesses with your athletes a little bit more clearly. But also teaches those metrics more effectively to your athletes because they can quickly see, how their distance per strokes impacts their speed. I'm sure you guys talk about it and harp about distance per stroke and stroke rate and everything with all of your athletes, but how much of it is sinking in? I think kids these days are super visual, so they're used to staring at their phones quite a bit. So if they can see it, they'll likely believe it, and they'll start to understand why you guys care so much about those different data points. So then once the workout's over, all that data is logged to each athlete's profile, and that's where we have our long-term tracking and analytics for each of your athletes on deck and after practice is over. So this makes it really simple for you to do test set reporting over time, tracking multiple athletes against each other over time. And this really helps you see, again, are your athletes actually getting faster over the season? Step one. But more importantly, how are they getting faster? Are they actually getting more efficient or are they just getting fitter? And it helps you pinpoint if something's going wrong throughout the season a little bit faster without having to rely on competition results later on in the season when it might be a bit too late to make a change. Also beyond that, we also have, if you've seen, we do have pro level data in the platform. So where we've annotated information from the Olympics and from World Championships, all built into the platform. We know that every national federation has their own annotation tool for race analysis. So we figured we just build it into our platform so you guys have access to that data as well and kind of open up that information to everybody. So for this, again, we're just trying to give you guys access to more information to make data-driven decisions and access to data after the fact. But also the big piece here is that it gives the athletes access to this information. We don't expect you to spend hours looking through data every single day or every week, but it does give the athletes information that they can dig into right after practice, as they'll get a notification with that information so they can see if they're getting better and if they're improving that behavioral skill you're trying to get them to improve over time. The other nice thing there is it helps you really celebrate those small wins throughout the season. So not just when I get a best time, but when I actually improve that skill that we're focusing on. So if I'm focusing on stroke length throughout the course of the season, it gives me something to actually, quantify that. Like, are my strokes actually getting longer? And you can say, hey, I hit that goal, coach. And then you can, give them that positive reinforcement, that they're doing well and that they're on track to hitting those goals at the end of the year. Okay, so that's the quick spiel about the current platform. It is pretty cool because we have seen some pretty cool success stories. So I pulled a bit of a story that we had actually about one of our coaches in Norway that had a pretty neat story through his use of the platform. So actually, when he first got the platform, he was using the units on one of his breaststrokers, and they were basically just trying to track their performance and see if they could make some small tweaks here and there because she was quite a good breaststroker, but they were trying to see how they could take it to the next level. So really what they were able to find though, originally when they were using the system, they saw on her 100 breast when they were doing short course, on her third leg, they'd see she'd really start trying to ramp up stroke rate through that third leg, trying to gain a little bit of speed so then she could bring it home on that final leg. But through the data, they kept seeing a weird anomaly where her stroke rate and her stroke count would actually spike on that third leg, and her speed would actually decrease. So she was ramping up her stroke rate and actually slowing down. So through that trend, they were actually able to see that she was obviously slipping through the water quite a bit, but they were able to see that she was actually getting slower through that input of additional effort. So kind of over the course of time, they were able to work on really lengthening that stroke over the course of a few months. And from there, they could see that progression coming down and actually leveling out her rates and her stroke count on that third leg and leveling out her speed. And then ultimately, when it came time to execute on a competition, she actually ended up not only winning the competition, getting the gold medal, but she broke a junior national record, which is pretty exciting for us to see as well. Cool. So that's a bit of our kind of current system. But now what I really wanted to focus more on this presentation is kind of the next step. Where can you take data beyond the data collection process in your actual practices to kind of a broader outlook? So really what we're now looking at is how we can utilize that data to obviously optimize performance gains, but also even minimize the risk of injury. So the big thing here, taking a bit of a step back, is when we're looking at training, what we're really trying to do, the output of our training, we're really just trying to improve our aerobic and or anaerobic systems. So the key here is that if you're monitoring the training and adapting your training programs, based on what's actually happening to the athlete in the pool, not based on what was planned to happen, but what's actually happening, you can ultimately iterate on your training program to really give the right amount of training, so the right volume and intensity of training to your athletes, but also the right type of training for your athletes. So really to do that, we need to quantify that kind of dosage of exercise that the athlete's getting, and also really plan our intensities based around that so that we can improve their response or their performance in their practices. So taking a look at this, basically the side of this that we're looking at now is looking at load monitoring, which we can now use to ultimately target the right amount of training that we're doing. And then where we can look at adaptation classification, where we can make sure that the athlete's getting the right balance of training types, so that ultimately they're making the necessary changes they need to make within their aerobic and anaerobic systems. So basically, to summarize here, the goal here is first of all quantifying that right amount of training through load monitoring, and then secondly, quantifying the right type of training through adaptation classification. So that first piece on load monitoring I'll dive into next. So when we're looking at load monitoring, what we're really looking at here is the balance between overtraining versus undertraining, and really trying to stay in that nice sweet spot that you see in the middle there. So really what this is doing is trying to give you the right amount of training to optimize your performance gain. So, I mean, sure, as you guys know, overtraining definitely puts your athletes at risk of injury as they're being stressed faster than the body can recover. But it also increases their risk and their susceptibility to illness, which is a big issue as well. And all of this just adds to the potential number of days that they spend out of the pool. Undertraining, something that a lot of people don't think about as well, is also a big risk, though. It can obviously reduce the body's fitness, but also affect the body's ability to recover from that next round of training. So on both sides, that can be a bit of a challenge. So, the reason this really matters, I pulled up a bunch of numbers here from a bunch of different research that's come out in the last few years, and some of it's pretty compelling. 67% of elite athletes are injured annually, so that's a pretty profound number. In the NCAA and Division I swimming, there's 4 to 5 injuries per 1,000 sessions of swimming. So again, pretty big numbers of injuries just from training. Also, the research, all basically agrees that the vast majority of athlete injuries are directly related to training load. But also on top of that, the risk of illness increases by 50 to 70% within those intensive training load periods. So this is, again, a challenge, especially, when we're in countries like Canada where, their intensive training load sessions are also, or seasons are in the cold times of the year when you're also that much more susceptible. So it's another thing that, you really need to take into account because it can take a lot out of your athletes and can take them out of the pool for time they really can't afford. So when it comes down to load monitoring and that change of load over time, really what the research shows is that the goal is really a bit of a 10% change in their workload on a week-over-week basis. So going up or down, about a 10% increase or decrease is the goal here. But the injury, or the research rather, is showing basically most coaches are increasing and decreasing by about 15 to 30% that load week over week. This is not great because this actually increases your risk of injury up to 30% likelihood as opposed to 5%. So it's putting your athletes at much higher risk than if you maintain that kind of more steady increase or decrease in workload. And I'm sure, as you guys know, ultimately a single injury or a single session or group of sessions out of the pool can really make a big difference on hitting the podium or not at the end of the year. So again, to summarize, what it's showing you here in this graphic here is that if you can effectively monitor the training load of your athletes, you can actually keep your risk of injury below 5%. So you can it's basically like an insurance policy for your athletes. It can really help out in the long run. So in terms of how we measure training load, this is basically broken down to 2 pieces, internal training load and external load. Internal load is really the athlete's perception of the effort that they're putting in, frequently measured by the athlete's rated perceived effort and a few other ways. Then the external load is really measured based on kind of finite outcomes that are happening in practice. So their speed, their splits, things like that. So, I mean, at a high level, this equation works out to just volume times their intensity, and there's multiple different ways that you can see that this can be measured. However, I guess, how was this measured today? Largely, this is monitored manually. So, I guess by a quick show of hands, who in this room currently monitors load on a regular basis with their athletes? Yeah. So not too many. And I'm sure not because you don't want to, but it is extremely time consuming to try to capture this information for every single athlete, every single session. And you have to do it every session because it's not valuable if you don't. So it's a challenge. And because of that, we have to simplify how we do it, which also decreases the accuracy of load monitoring. So right now it's done based on volume, basically just being measured by the total session time or the total distance swam, and then intensity is done strictly based on rated perceived effort, or RPE. This is definitely better than nothing, but it's a pretty crude estimation, which is, again, a challenge in terms of accuracy. Volume per session is a challenge in swimming specifically because we have a lot of rest time that gets taken into account in that, and that doesn't really accurately represent how much time they're swimming. Volume by distance is tough because frequently you're doing it based on the planned distance, not based on the actual distance, which again is not exactly an accurate representation. And then intensity solely based on the athlete's input of RPE is a challenge because athletes are not always great about doing what you tell them to do. So that's another risk at that point with compliance. So the next step that we're really looking at is how can we automate this process, because realistically, that's the only way to get all of you guys to have your hands up for when I ask the question about load monitoring. Because again, I know you guys don't have time in the day to be monitoring your athletes' training load, so we really do have to find a way to automate that process. So the other big piece of this is the accuracy behind load monitoring. And if you're doing it on the session level where you're just assuming the total distance swam times their effort, that's just going to give you a pretty crude estimation of the entire workout. So what we're going to be doing is taking it down to the entire repetition level, where we can actually tell you the volume based on the distance of the rep, as well as their intensity, where we're actually looking at their kind of actual output speed compared against ultimately their critical swim speed, or their speed intensity curve based on their personal bests in these events. So we can actually give you a repetition-based load, and from that we'll then combine it over the course of the entire workout to give you the entire external training load, and then ultimately add up our internal training load with that, giving you the total swimming time with the rated perceived effort, which I'll talk about a bit later as well, which will give you much more accurate representation of what's happening in terms of load on your athletes. So the whole point of this, that's kind of the science behind it, but the whole point of this is to really simplify this process so you can really just track your athletes over the course of time to make sure you're gauging that risk of undertraining and overtraining. This is done with thresholds that are generally measured with this acute to chronic workload ratio, where basically you're trying to just measure how much and how fast you're training or changing that workload. But basically you're trying to keep it within bounds of about 80% to 150%, and that effectively will keep your injury risk, as you can see here, in that sweet spot below 5%, which is the big push for us. So in terms of how this looks in the system, that's the complicated part, but this is basically just simple. This is just building it out for you automatically. The way we're going to be doing this is just using the units in session. That'll give you all the data that you need to do this. But the whole concept behind this, then the athlete gets their RPE added in just through our mobile app right after practice. So again, makes it much easier for them to input right away. And then effectively, we'll just give you this this entire workload tracking over the course of time. And we can quickly flag if your athlete's at risk. Right. So if one week you see I'm at risk of overtraining, or they've gone over that kind of threshold mark, that means you can adjust your training plan again the next week to make sure that that comes back down and that you don't put them at risk of injury again. So that's what we're really trying to do. Automate this process so that you can iterate on your training plan a bit more effectively, not just do it based on what happened in your training sessions or your planning sessions at the beginning of the year. Cool. So that's basically how we can tell you the right volume of training that your athletes are doing, which is the big first question. The next big thing is if they're doing the actual right types of training in the water. So when we're looking at, I guess, our training plans, I mean, when you're actually scheduling your workouts and your sets and everything from the beginning of the season, what we're really trying to do from our training output is make adaptations to their aerobic and anaerobic systems, right? Their aerobic work with their long distance, low impact activity, their anaerobic with their high intensity, high rest kind of sets where you're building up lactate. Right now, these can be measured, these adaptations can be measured with these markers like VO2 max, VO2 steady, VLA max, etc. But naturally, these are not that easy to track on a regular basis. Ultimately, they can help you assess what types of training that you need based on those deficiencies, but realistically, it's not that easy to track these things on a regular basis. But again, if you do know what happens and where your kind of shortfalls are, you can plan your sessions and your training programs around what type of training you need. Do I need more aerobic? Do I need more anaerobic? Based on that plan. So again, when we do this in practice, we usually simplify this into different training zones. So I guess based on a quick show of hands, how many of you guys plan your sessions or your seasons around some form of I mean, there's different forms, but around some form of aerobic, anaerobic training zones? Okay, yeah, so good number. So that's pretty common practice to structure your entire season around specific training zones that you're trying to hit. And ultimately, yeah, there's different methodologies for this. There's sub zones and a whole bunch of things. But really, what this is doing is just kind of simplifying, the intensity that your athletes are training at, which is really a continuous intensity, but we simplify it into zones to make it easier to break down. So what this is, it's not really so important about the actual zones in and of themselves. It's more about the adaptation that results from training in that zone. So really what we're trying to do is plan sets that will result in some adaptation on my athlete, right? Am I trying to, gain some speed or neuromuscular power adaptation with my sprinters, for example? Am I trying to get more aerobic compensation or what have you? So there's different, adaptations that you want to get out of specific types of training. And that's really why we structure them in this way, so that we can get different things out of our athletes, and so that they grow and adapt their aerobic, anaerobic systems in different ways. So the nice thing with this is, because we've got it broken down into these zones, and you guys already build your sets based around different zones similar to this, all of that is based around intensity, rest, and rep duration at the end of the day. So these are all based around numbers. So the idea there is that you can actually classify effectively what sets are reacting into different zones or are resulting in specific adaptations. So the way that we're going to be doing this on the platform for you is, again, we'll do all the kind of math in the background, but we'll be doing real-time classification of your sets, so we can actually tell you, what style of training or what type of training is resulting in the water. Not just what you planned, which is good, but really what's happening in the water, and does that line up with what was planned. So again, this as I said, relies on their swim speed, their duration of the set, as well as the different rest into that set, and then ultimately this will allow you to output exactly a big workout breakdown around their aerobic anaerobic ratio, their workout adaptation focus for that day, and then again their time swum in each specific zone. So that'll help you guys get a better understanding of what's happening in the water, not just what was planned previous to practice. So, and I'll come back to that in a second. So how this works, again, we're going to be providing this information over time, similar to load monitoring. The whole concept here is that you can track it not just on a single session basis, but over a longer period of weeks and months and what have you, to see if what's happening in the water is actually aligning to what you planned at the beginning of the year. And then if it's not, if it's diverging, then you can start to focus on changing your training plan around what's missing, right? So if you're starting to see partway through the season, hey, we're actually not getting nearly as much aerobic capacity work in as we thought we were going to be getting in, then effectively you can adjust your training plan and get that back up so that you don't run into a nasty surprise by the end of the year when the right type of work wasn't really accomplished with certain athletes. So again, that's that whole concept of iterating your training plans on a more regular basis based on data, not just based on what's happening in competition. So we can classify these zones automatically, which is nice. So we'll simplify that process where we'll basically be classifying against the athletes, again, their maximum speeds in specific events. So we can give you specific zones for specific athletes. Or if you guys already have lactate testing that has been done and you have specific zones, you can also input that manually to simplify that process. So, I mean, again, this is another question for you guys. In terms of, your seasonal plan, when you're building out how you're going to be training and, what your sets are going to look like over the course of the year, how often do you guys modify your seasonal plan, actually based on quantifiable data, not just based on competition results? Do you guys do that on a regular, semi-regular basis, or crickets? Not too many. So it's not easy because we plan a session to be a certain way, and it's hard for us to know if the athlete is reacting in the same way that we expected them to react in. So that's one of the challenges. So what we're trying to do here is make that easy for you to actually see what's happening in the pool and see if your athletes are actually reacting the way you wanted them to react in a specific set. So again, a good quote that this kind of aligns well with that we pulled out from Bill Sweetenham and John Atkinson's book from 2003 states that the coach and the swimmer should monitor training in all the training zones, because what the coach and swimmer expect and what they get are often different. So that's really what we're trying to adapt here, is the fact that the plan and reality don't always line up, right? Things happen throughout the season. Things differ. Whatever, kids miss a few workouts, they get sick, and then suddenly they're pretty far off from where you actually plan for them to be based on this different training plan. So what we're doing is giving you that ability to iterate more often on the seasonal plan to really help you optimize those gains and adaptations with your athletes. So again, the impacts of these, of these kinds of tools, it will first of all give you guys a better understanding of your kind of workout planning process. So what we're saying there is that when you're planning a set to be in a specific zone or specific region or have specific effects on your athletes, you'll now have output from your athletes, basically explaining, if that was true, first of all, how many athletes it actually resulted in that kind of training, and then you could use that set more often or less often, depending on that. But it'll give you a bit of a better understanding of what's actually happening there. It'll also give you a quick glance if you need to actually make modifications for specific athletes during training. But overall, it'll again help you with that overall overtime training effect. The other big piece is that it'll obviously keep you guys educated on swimming physiology and how that impacts your athletes, but also keep your athletes educated on what's happening there as well. Because we know it's important, if your athletes are really going to take it to the next level, they need to really be accountable and know what's going on when they train in a specific way, and how is that training actually impacting their body moving forward, right? The other big piece here is that kind of challenge with coaches and athletes not always converging on this, on I guess the goal of a specific set. So I think the biggest problem that we always see is on the slow, easy sets, on our aerobic sets. Athletes frequently go too fast, and then they really don't end up, they're then not able to go fast enough on those hard sets. And this is a very common challenge. And now if athletes are educated behind this and know why they need to go very slow because it's going to result in a specific adaptation, then we can effectively train them better and educate them better on these effects, and hopefully get them to follow those sessions a little bit more closely. Also beyond this, it also helps with that athlete engagement piece. So what we're trying to add in here is giving that additional positive reinforcement to these athletes. So if they had a really hard training session, they're going to know exactly what came out of that training session and why did they do it? Why did coach put me through that really crappy set that left me wrecked for the entire day? But now they're going to know that helped them in a specific way and why they needed to do that. Okay. So, at a quick glance, that's the broader picture of where we're looking with this. So, our whole platform and our whole methodology is trying to utilize this data to help you guys optimize the limited time you have with your athletes. There's a limited amount of time that they have in the season, and we're really trying to help you guys make the most out of that time. Starting with our first set of tools, which is really about optimizing efficiency and effectiveness on deck, allowing you guys to do what you can in a bit of more of an effective way. The next big piece about optimizing the quantity of training you have with all of your athletes and minimizing risk so that they stay in the pool more often. Then the last piece there is, again, optimizing that quality of training to make sure that they're doing what needs to be done at the right time of the season, so that by the end of the year, they're really where they need to be. Okay. So this is the baseline platform. This is where we're looking on the team level. But really one of the big things that we've been looking at from the last year as well is now how do you take this data to the next level? So this is when we started working with federations and talking with countries effectively about how can you utilize data at a broader scale to drive more outcomes for an entire country. Because the way that we've seen it is that ultimately data at a large scale can ultimately fundamentally improve an entire generation of athletes if utilized properly. So some of the big things that we're looking at here is even heat maps outlining trends and strengths and weaknesses across a country based on athlete data from training. So one thing that we see very commonly is that coaches that grow up in a specific area, getting coached in a specific way, then become coaches and then coach their athletes in a very similar way. So we see actually geographically that skill sets are very aligned with that coach's training style, and they frequently maybe don't leave or don't go very far from their original training area. So we see athletes with better underwater skills from a specific region, maybe athletes with better high-end stroke rate on their freestyle in another area. So we can actually help you guys outline that overall heat mapping to help you guys figure out where strengths and weaknesses might lie, and help you guys address that to better support coaches and athletes all over our country remotely a little bit more effectively. This again all ties into this bigger picture of advanced scouting and really trying to funnel more athletes to the top levels. So one of the big things that I think John and Eden were talking about yesterday was about how do we optimize the number of athletes that we can get to the top level, maximize that conversion, knowing there's limited resources and limited amount of time in the day. And that's a great program that they've got with basically the on-track times and basically making sure that athletes are getting supported where they need to be. But what we're looking at is taking that to the next step, where we can start to optimize that funnel of athletes and scouting platforms based on fundamental skills, not just based on times. Because one of the things that we've seen as well is that if you're a 11, 12-year-old athlete, a lot of your size will take a big impact on your speed in the water. But if you have fundamental skills that are very strong moving forward, that'll ultimately help you a lot more later on. I think most sports scientists would want you to have obviously much higher skill sets or your better quality skills once they become 18 or 19, as opposed to be faster with crappy skills, again, which would just flatline you and keep you at the same, that same speed for a long period of time. Whereas that kid with really good skills likely can, in the right training environment, excel and become much faster over a longer period of time. So ultimately, at the end of the day here, what we're trying to do is really just take as many athletes as possible in a country and take it all the way up to the top level. Because again, it's all about stats and probability. The more athletes you get to the top level that keep on improving, the more medals that you guys are going to generate in your respective countries. And then the load monitoring piece takes this into account as well. It's basically not having a leaky funnel. If your athletes are getting injured all the time and out of the pool, and they're just going to get out of the sport eventually. So trying to keep as many athletes in that funnel as possible. It'll also provide this overall, learning across the federation. You guys in your respective countries, again, you're all in this together. It's to get more medals for the country at the end of the day, and how you guys can help each other do that. I think if you can have overall learning within a country, makes that very, very powerful. So I think especially in countries where we're smaller populations, Canada and Denmark, and basically most Scandinavian countries, we're competing against bigger monster countries that might have tons of population, tons of athletes that they can wreck a few athletes on the way up, and it's still okay because they'll still have good athletes at the end of the day. But we've really got to make the most out of all the athletes that we have. So the goal here is how do we make the most out of every single athlete and make sure we get the most to the very top level to, at the end of the day, output more international medals. So again, this is the goal of really maximizing results for an entire nation based on data. So, in terms of how we operate, we're around the world with our technology, but I'm more showing this to kind of emphasize the fact that while this stuff might seem pretty high level for many club teams, and that this is mainly for elite athletes, maybe I would say that the vast majority of the people that we work with are actually club teams. What we see is it's definitely great to have these tools at the top level. Don't get me wrong; the elite athletes, they need this. You need to tweak everything you can to get the most out of them. But really, where this has the biggest impact are on young athletes. If you can start making these changes and these behavioral changes and changing their training programs from a young age, this will have a vast impact on their entire trajectory over the course of their career. So really, this is where we're looking to help teams progress their athletes over the course of their career, not just at the very, very top level. So the starting point with us is usually around 8 years old that we work with kids all the way up to the very, very top levels. So this isn't about sales pitch, but I think ourselves at Triton, where we're really passionate about how we can utilize data to further the sport, and we think regardless of if it's us or somebody else, this is the way that the sport's going. It's the way most sports are going, or every sport, I think, for that matter. So if we can better utilize data to drive athletes further and drive the sport further, I think it's a great investment of time. So I think that's pretty much all I had today. So I've got a little bit of extra time here for questions, or if you guys want to see it in action, definitely feel free to come by the booth or just chat swimming or anything else. Definitely come by as well. All right, thank you.
Good speed. So we'll take questions from the floor here, since I didn't get any questions up here on the monitor. So we have some questions about this to Tristan. Something that might have been.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. So I think one of the cool things in terms of data collection that we've had, I mean, we've got a massive database of tens of millions of kilometers of swimming data of all these different metrics. One of the cool things that we've been able to see is the way that all these different metrics actually impact an athlete's speed in the water, and some cool models that we've been able to build to that. So the thing that we've realized is, I mean, I think all of you realize there's no perfect equation for the perfect athlete, but each athlete has their own perfect equation. So if I'm a specific physiology, specific size, and I am currently this speed with this distance per stroke, this stroke rate, if I want to get to this speed, there's the most kind of efficient way to get faster. And that's something that we've been able to see. So it's not necessarily about just ramping up my stroke rate to get faster. We can actually see the most efficient path or path of least resistance for an athlete to get faster. So that's a really cool thing that we've been able to dig out of this. And again, stuff that we're going to try to add into the platform in the future. But it's kind of ongoing research now that this amount of data exists in the sport.
What are your next thoughts?
Thank you. What are your next thoughts for the development of your wear?
For sure.
We talked about heart rate.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think heart rate's always been our kind of golden egg next piece. That's where we've always wanted to go with this. There's been a lot of heart rate monitors out there, but they've all been not great, I think, and they've had their downsides. So we're trying to make sure we do it properly before we release it. But that's definitely our next big piece is how do we get heart rate? Because I think once you have the kind of data that we have and your workouts being fully built out automatically with data, having that overlaid heart rate on top of that is extremely powerful as well. And also just adds to the other tools here that I brought in. So I think heart rate's the next big piece for us. We're adding GPS as well will be the next big piece, so you can use it in open water. And then beyond that, we've also talked about the opportunity for audio feedback or real-time feedback to the athlete while they train. And we're still toying with that idea because currently our units are used in competition quite a bit. And if you give feedback to the athlete, we can't use it in competition. So it's a bit of a balance on that front. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of cool stuff that we can do with this.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
What about this notion of training load?
Yep.
Are you familiar with heart rate variability?
Yep. A little bit. Yeah.
So what do you think about that? Heart rate variability is that when you have a lot of stress on your system, the time between your heartbeats tend to be more similar than when you have not enough stress on your body. Mm-hmm. So there's a change in how fast or how the frequency of the heart rate and the time between the heart rates as you get overstressed in the system. What are your thoughts on that concept as far as monitoring training?
Yeah, no, I think we've looked at a bunch of that stuff and tying it into what we're doing in load monitoring. I think this idea of load monitoring is kind of the bigger picture load monitoring over a long period of time, and heart rate variability is more often used in a shorter time period. But I think it could be added in effectively to this concept of load monitoring. Again, for us, it's a technology limitation right now. We don't have heart rate, so for us, we can't really do load monitoring in that way. But also, I think most research done in swimming right now doesn't have that because there's no really good way to get consistent heart rate over the entire swim. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of challenges with respect to that. You can get heart rate maybe once a length, but getting it over the course of an entire session is a bit more challenging. So again, I think it would be very additive to this kind of work, and that's why I say the next big piece for us will be heart rate because it adds a whole new level to basically every platform that we're building out here.
Yeah, but most of that stuff they do at rest, though.
Yeah.
So they have the sympathetic response of the nervous system and how much of an impact the previous training session has had
like when they
on
wake up in the morning. Yeah. So I mean, I think there's some other companies that focus on that kind of work. Again, most of our work right now is in training, but yeah, I think there's definitely different research on if you're ready for a good training session that day. I would say we haven't spent a lot of time focusing on that component of it, but yeah. Nothing. Either bored everybody or.
Well, I'm fascinated because I'm a physiologist.
Okay, cool. All right.
I'll throw one more at you. So what about this notion of recovery to make the improvement that you actually tell the body to do in training? Do you have any data on that as far as time for workouts and length and load for each
or like
workout?
periodization and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've looked at is more, I guess, around the seasonal planning piece and how that periodization should be built in and scheduled in that plan. So most of what I'm showing you here would be relative to the plan that was put in place at the beginning of the season. So it's not us necessarily telling you this is the right plan for your athlete. It's more you guys decided a specific plan to get you to, a specific taper period, specific competition at the end of the year. And then it's more how are you tracking against that plan. So I would say, I think there's a lot of work that can be done in that space. But I would say, right now, I don't think we've done enough work on that front to be able to give you the, I guess, ideal plan for your athlete per se, to make sure that you're getting the right amount of upkeep and recovery to get maximal gains. But I think through research, through the data, we'll be able to see a lot of information from that hasn't really existed in a huge amount within swimming specifically.
More questions? More questions? All right. So we'll thank you again, Tristan, right there.
Cheers. Thank you.
And
The next session starts 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock next session.